Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Whether you're a pastor, church leader, or a passionate member of your faith community, this podcast is designed to challenge, inspire, and equip you with the tools you need for impactful ministry. And now for a little bit about the guest for this episode.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. Today, Loren Richmond Jr. welcomes David Taylor to the program. W. David O. Taylor is Associate Professor of Theology and Culture at Fuller Theological Seminary and the author of several books, including Prayers for the Pilgrimage, A Body of Praise, Open and Unafraid, Glimpses of the New Creation, and The Theater of God's Glory. In addition to a range of scholarly and popular essays, he has also edited several books, including The Art of New Creation, Contemporary Art and the Church, and For the Beauty of the Church, Casting a Vision for the Arts. He serves on the advisory board for Duke Initiatives in Theology and the Arts, as well as IVP Academics series, Studies in Theology and the Arts. An ordained priest, he has lectured widely on the arts, from Thailand to South Africa. In 2016, he produced a short film on the Psalms with Bono and Eugene Peterson. He lives in Austin, Texas, with his children and artist wife Phaedra, with whom he has produced 3 sets of illustrated prayer cards. A reminder before we start today's conversation, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast, leave a review, and share Future Christian with a friend. Connect with Loren, Martha, and Future Christian on Instagram. Shoot us an email at loren@resonatemediapro.com with comments, questions, or ideas for future episodes. We appreciate your voice in how we faithfully discern the future of the church.
All right, welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. This is Loren Richmond Jr., and I'm pleased to be welcoming today David Taylor. So thank you for being here. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Great. Share, if you would, anything about yourself we don't know already.
Well, let's see. In recent years, my wife and I purchased 21 acres just east of Austin, and we have only just recently finished the construction of the house. And my wife comes from multiple generations of farmers. I do not. I appreciate somebody like Wendell Berry, but I'm not a fanatic. But I have found myself coming alive in ways that I had not imagined myself coming alive, because so much of my life now involves working the land. And it's very life-giving. So we live out here surrounded by prairie. Well, it used to be cornfields, cotton fields, amaranth fields. But this, we're part of what's an ecology called the Blackland Prairie. It kind of goes up, I think, up into North Texas, maybe southern Arkansas. And my wife did what's called a Master Naturalist Certificate, where she learned everything that can be learned about the local ecology. And one of her hopes is to return this, land that has been cultivated for, decades and centuries back to its original prairie condition. And I'm happy to participate in that. It's quite wonderful.
Well, that's a cool little thing. That's a cool little factoid. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah.
Share, if you would, about kind of your faith journey and background and what that looks like today.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Guatemala City. My parents were missionaries there. My parents also put us in a private Austrian school. So I spoke English at home, Spanish with friends at church, and German at school. And, from a very early age, I found myself wired to kind of the global world, kind of global context, global church. And I'm grateful for that formative experience. Moved to the States when I was 13, but still it just left a very deep impression on how I perceive the world, how I perceive my place in the world. I am, technically I'm what's called a third culture kid. I would think of myself as amphibious, occupying different kinds of spaces, as it were. I was surrounded by people who had a very genuine, sincere, faith. They felt that they had had these life transforming encounters with God. And so it was all very real to them. Like there was always something at stake when we gathered on Sundays. And I have not always found that to be the case in my adult life here in the States. Eventually went to the University of Texas, lost my faith, eventually recovered my faith, and then spent 5 years in seminary, and then 10 years as a pastor, and then 5 years in the PhD world, and then I've been teaching theology for 10 years. And I would say that one of the things that's very important to me is this sense that I feel called to the twin work of pastoring and scholarship. So I would think of myself as a scholar priest, and I sincerely and eagerly want both of those callings to implicate the other. That my ordination is not simply a certificate, but that it not only invites me to be a certain kind of professor, a certain kind of theologian, but it obligates me, it inconveniences my capacity to be, as it were, maximally efficient as an academic. And so I try to be very involved as much as possible in our local congregation. Mostly I teach Sunday school with children. So I find that very formative for me.
That's a brave spiritual practice, teaching children.
It is, it's humbling, but not in a bad way humbling. It's like, it's a wonderful, it's simplifying, right? Things are complicated in the child's life in the way that children can sometimes feel very overwhelmed by all the moving parts of life. But there's also a kind of simplicity, a kind of, they don't dissimulate. They don't pretend usually to be something that they're not in the way that adults can easily, present something that is not maybe true to who they are somewhere deep down inside. So kids are not afraid to ask questions, not afraid to ask hard questions, and not afraid to ask theological questions. And so I love the opportunity and the challenge to think concretely. The Gospels are just full of concrete things. And the danger of an academic life is that all, sort of floats up into abstractions. So
right.
It's fun. Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, my son is 6 right now, and he's really asking a lot of those questions that, again, those kind of concrete, like, he asked me about heaven just the other day. And, he said, this past week or a few weeks ago, hey, my friends at school, not a lot of them believe in God. So it is really challenging. I'm like thinking, I have so many years of theological education, so many years of experience. How do I answer this question in a way that's going to make sense to him?
Right.
And not just be totally over his head.
That's really good. Yeah. Actually, let me just say this, just as an aside, but related to that. I have the possibility of taking a sabbatical in a couple of years. And yesterday I was working on my application, and I have to identify what I would like to do. And there's an academic monograph that I like to do. But the other thing I really have been wanting to do for quite a number of years, I'm wondering if I might finally be able to pull it off, is to write a theology book for children. But that would entail a partnership with artists. So very much, like a visual theology, where the art is part of the telling of the story, not merely illustrating, but part of the telling of the story, showing, obviously, not just telling. And I'm excited and terrified about the project, but mostly excited. And I want to write it with the kids. So, I'll probably spend several years, workshopping it with kids. So we'll see how that works.
Yeah. I want to see that. I want to see that come to be. I want to see that come to be. Yeah. Well, speaking of books, I'm excited to have this conversation, and I'm thinking already here about some questions that have percolated in my mind around curiosities I've been wondering about. So David is the author of the book, A Body of Praise, Understanding the Role of Our Physical Bodies in Worship. Do you want to just start out with a general, like, hey, how did this book come to be? What inspired it?
Yeah, I mean, I was raised in a tradition, let's say a non-denominational tradition, that at best thought of the body as neutral, at worst as a problem, to be overcome, to be solved, to be superseded, transcended, so on and so forth. When I was in seminary, I did a THM in New Testament and wrote a project investigating the theological significance of Jesus' healing miracles, particularly in the Gospel of Luke. And I came away from that study with sort of this stark realization that I, in my entire life, had taken bodies much less seriously than Jesus had taken them. And there's a sense of excitement and adventure. I've always loved sports, so I've always used my body. I've been surrounded by artists, so I've had a sense that artists, are particularly attuned to sensory things. But I think when I came out of that project and then, began years of pastoring, I just kept being haunted by, well, what does that mean? What does it mean to live into this reality? What does it mean to live more holy? WHOLLY. And then I would find myself in liturgical settings and, sometimes asking folks in these liturgical settings, whether Catholic, Orthodox, Episcopal, Lutheran, or otherwise, why do you do what you do? And surprised by how few people were able to articulate why they did all that they did with their bodies. So I wondered myself initially, well, what if I just produced a little handbook?
Yeah.
Handbook, a little grammar of the body at worship and a little history, a little Bible, a little theology, a little context, culture. Well, I started writing that, and then I became curious about other things.
Right.
What might the sciences tell us, and what are some ethical questions we need to attend to, and how might artists offer unique perspectives and invitations to embody? And so then it just kept getting bigger and bigger. And what originally was conceived as a lay handbook turned into an academic book. But I tried to write it in a way that the English is eminently accessible to anybody who would, be curious about this. And I wrote it right around COVID. So, I, along with all the humans, was experiencing something that was certainly unique to our generation, not unique to human history, but something that confronted us with the question of, what are bodies for? So yeah, that's the book.
Yeah. So let's jump in because there's a lot of interesting stuff, at least to me, I found that I want to hear your perspectives on. So I think one thing for sure that stood out to me is you write about posture and physical body movements in our worship impacting our faith. So talk more about that.
Yeah. Okay. So a few things come to mind. Having been raised in a Latin American culture, my childhood was shaped by a world where it was more easy for boys to cry. That is a
more easy than girls.
No, I'm sorry, than American.
Oh, gotcha.
In contrast to the American.
Yeah.
And so when I moved to the States when I was 13, I discovered very quickly.
Yeah, boys don't cry.
How very uncool it was to cry. And that's not so much a posture or a movement, but it is an expression. A way that God has made us, has hardwired us physiologically and neurologically in order to become attuned to ourselves and attuned to others, and others can be attuned to our pain. It's a way for us to be fully present to each other. And so, wondered to myself, what is it that we are losing, if not, in what ways are being malformed by, for example, the fact that so many of our social cultures and then therefore ecclesial liturgical cultures have no space for crying and weeping and those forms of grief. And yet they're profoundly, psalmic. Certainly Jesus is unashamed of those things. And how might our grief be more sweetly and richly shared with one another if we felt free to cry in public? So that'd be like one. I've often been curious about silence and shouting. two extremes, but both are in the Psalms, right? And the Psalms have functioned as this determinative worship prayer book for Christians for hundreds and hundreds of years. And yet we either pick and choose our way through the Psalms, or we have what I might call the canon within the canon of the Psalter. Yeah. And yet I think there is something about God that we cannot know except by way of silence, and likewise by way of shouting. And we know that, right? When we find ourselves in certain places in nature, and there's that, what we might call a holy hush, right? That we're feeling and sensing and knowing and being, regarded, as it were, by creation in this silence that makes us feel, simultaneously small in creation, but also profoundly seen and grounded and fully alive, right? Conversely, if you've ever been to a concert or a sporting event and you find yourself willingly swept up, right? Yeah. In this roar of excitement, right? And your whole body is just full. Like, this is the expansion of excitement and joy, and it erupts in shouting. It's that sense of like, yes, there's some quality of our humanity that we tap into and that we share with others. And I wonder, well, are we missing out? Right. And the Psalms are repeatedly saying, roar, exalt, shout, but we don't. Like, why don't we? It's right there. And then maybe the last is, there was this artist named Grunwald, early 1500s, was commissioned to paint, to create a painting for the monastery of St. Anthony, which had a very specific call to serve those with skin diseases of some kind or another, as he paints. It's very famous. This triptych of Jesus, and he represents him with the same kind of skin lesions that they have. And so what did it mean for these individuals who found themselves in various degrees of pain and on account of their skin, to be able to see, the maker of heaven and earth, to see the Savior and the Redeemer in a way that it was so intimately familiar to them. That this Christ had come so close that he identified. What are we missing when our spaces of worship don't have something like that for us to behold with our physical eyes, that then might bear witness to the eyes of our heart, as the New Testament puts it, and then enable us to see the world around us in sort of transformed, transfigured ways. All these things that we, see, all our senses, all the things that we do, our hands raised, our hands held open, hands at humility, hands in honor, postures of honor. How might that form our humanity more holy, in both senses of the word holy?
Yeah. Yeah, I want to get into this deeper because this past week, my wife and I, with our kids, we attend like this kind of like family type small group that's like a meal and conversation at church. And I guess the church is involved in a study through some organization that's of course funded through Lilly, because Lilly, you've probably seen this, is doing just this, shelling out tons of money to try to study children's faith formation. And this was like a small group, there's probably 15, 20, I don't remember, in this kind of group conversation. So the questions was being raised about like, how do you foster faith in your own family? How do you think we can help foster faith? And it seemed to be like I was trying to, I'm just a lay person there essentially in this church context space. So I'm trying not to overstep my bounds. But it seemed to be like a lot of like what I would call like performative from families of this, like, we kind of just make it up as we go type thing. And maybe I was mishearing, but almost like a limiting or diminishing of practices. So I'm being long-winded here, but I'm thinking about what is the importance of physical faith practices, physical spiritual practices of retaining faith.
Like how is what we do with our bodies related directly or indirectly to the formation of faith? Is that right?
Let me add another story if I can. So years ago, I was working as a hospital chaplain, as a CP intern. And I walked into this, I got a page in the middle of the night and walked into this secure room, as a psych hold room. And they're literally, I was standing outside, so they're literally like strapping this guy down who was having some kind of overdose reaction. I don't know exactly what. And he's flailing all over. And I'm freaking out internally, right? Thinking, what the heck? Why did these people call me? And I remember someone saying like he had supposedly uttered the word chaplain, or I don't know. I'm like, I cannot believe that this guy really asked for chaplain. But, I'm young. I don't know better. I'm like, this is my job. So they finished getting him strapped down, and the security guards and kind of come out and take off their gloves and take a deep breath. And I walk in with like a Bible, and I'm like, hey, my name's Loren. I'm a chaplain, and I have no idea what to do. And I start reading some scripture from, I think it was Psalms 90 or Psalm 91. I can't remember exactly which.
Right.
And then all of a sudden, like, I recognize this guy starts to pray in a very broken manner, the Lord's Prayer.
Yeah. Right.
And I was completely struck. Like, that was 10, 15 years ago. I'm still struck by that moment.
Yeah. I mean, that's really beautiful. And I mean, our Catholic and Orthodox friends would say yes. So, quite precisely, that the rituals of our body, when matched to, communal rituals, have a capacity to form our humanity, to orient our sense of the world around us. Sort of as a parallel, there's a book called After Image, in which this film scholar did a study of I don't know, it's like 6 or 7 very famous Catholic filmmakers, like Francis Ford Coppola and Alfred Hitchcock and Scorsese. And one of the things that the case that he was making to the reader is that all these extraordinarily successful filmmakers making really, really important, films over the course of the last, half century, they were all raised Catholic. And the Catholic sensorium, as it were, the liturgy, had shaped how they perceived their calling and their work.
Yeah.
And so what we do with our bodies, from an early age, it is and can, shape Christ-likeness in us. One thing that our church started doing after COVID, when it was, safe to be in each other's physical, proximate spaces, was during the Lord's. We say the Lord's Prayer every Sunday. Our senior minister, our rector, invited us to hold hands. And, holding hands is such a funny thing. In some contexts, it's the most natural thing in the world. Like when, NFL athletes, at the national anthem, or when somebody's injured, they'll hold hands. But get them outside of the stadium is a different context, right? Yep. It means something else, and it causes maybe discomfort. But our pastor was encouraging us to lean into the actual physicality of each other's presence. We have, people of all ages, maybe we have visitors, but the act of holding is a way to say, I am bound to you. You are not a take it or leave it member of Christ's body.
Right.
And so how might those practices in a liturgical setting then translate into the rest of our lives? I write about this in the book, like this question, which is not a simplistic question, or it's not simple. Like who's up front, or what testimonies are shared?
Yes.
Is it the testimony of the bold and the beautiful and the brawny? Or is it the testimony, the witness of the broken, and all kinds of brokenness in our world, physical, mental, emotional, relational, and so on? What is it that we see? What are the stories that are told? And I don't mean just in art, just in our own lives. And so, well, in actual fact, I'll say this, then I'll pause here, but, in the chapter on ethics, which was the most terrifying to write of the whole book, I truly wrote it with a great deal of fear and trembling. But we had a family in our congregation, have 2 children with very specific disabilities, one with Down syndrome and the other with what's called a SWAN, a syndrome without a name. And, different levels of intellectual and physical disability. And so when I began writing this, and I did, a good deal of reading, but I wanted to talk to, real humans that dealt with this in real ways, not in like bookish ways. So I asked the parents, like, what's it like for you? I asked them, what would you want from us as a congregation? Like, what forms of hospitality are you not receiving? And that was wonderful. But the thing that was so beautiful was to hear the parents talk about how, in as much as our worship is, let's call it liturgical, is very sort of ritualized, that their children, Henry and Layla, have learned the good news in their bodies. By standing, sitting, kneeling, prostrate, by walking. Layla, when she was 13, was invited to be a crucifer, and we have different weights of crosses. And so she could only manage, the lightest weight wooden one, but it was such a beautiful, image of Christ's body to see her fully engaged, joyfully engaged, very reverently engaged in unique ways to her. And that the things that were said over and over were part of her spiritual armature, as it were.
Right.
And so I don't know, just the things that, as they say, caught, not taught, are rather powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm thinking again, I just had on, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the book, Worship in an Age of Anxiety, J. Michael Jordan. He's kind of an evangelical,
yeah.
Okay. You're for,
I am. Yeah. I have it actually.
I really like the book. I think his episode will release here before this. And then, of course, I'm thinking of the theologian that's really resonated with me a lot, Andrew Root, both who kind of talk about the kind of performative nature of faith. And I'm thinking of Michael Jordan talks about this similarly. You write about the value of communal singing versus again, as Jordan in his context writes about the big band and the big production of evangelical worship. And I don't want to just bang on, evangelical worship per se, but again, I'm thinking in this context of how Root would say we have to perform our faith, has to be something we endeavor to produce within ourselves.
Right.
And again, I'm thinking from the context of how I've been in church recently where I did not want to say the words that were on the screen. My faith was not in a place where I was
right,
full-hearted that.
Right.
But I feel there was some benefit to me in repeating those words.
Yeah. I mean, Loren, I'm just going to say amen. And we've been there. And I think if you're honest enough, you've been a Christian long enough, you know exactly that experience. Having grown up in a predominantly Catholic country, I don't think I bring to my, adult academic studies a romantic view of how the liturgy, as it were, forms us in magical ways. It doesn't. There's nothing magical or automatic about doing any ritual, right? And I would likewise say no ecclesial liturgical tradition has a corner on the market of mindless, heartless worship. I mean, it could be a very simple, sort of.
Yeah. And Jordan for sure talks about that.
Yeah. So, Baptist, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Methodist, anybody can be mindless and heartless no matter what they say or don't say. But I do think, again, that there is a unique power in being formed and reformed by what we perform, if I can put all those forms side by side. Obviously, to borrow language from the Second Vatican gatherings in the 60s, we want our worship somehow to be full, active, and conscious. All things being equal, in the sense that when you see the words on the screen or on a piece of paper or in a book, and you think to yourself, I don't feel it, I think that can become a really beautiful form of confession. Humility to say, in this moment, oh God, I do not, and yet in humility and in trust, with whatever trust I can muster, I say these words. And what I tell our people, whenever I have a chance to preach or otherwise, is it's okay to come on Sunday morning and simply sit and do nothing else. The fact that you've put your body in this place is already something that we can celebrate. I also say maybe you can't even manage to come, and there's a grace for that as well. also there are inertias that take over, like the whole COVID, post-COVID, all these studies have been done of people that got into the habit, right, of not leaving their physical homes and gathering with other physical bodies and physical spaces. And eventually that acquired an inertia and that took over, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a positive inertia in us gathering, doing things in our bodies, performing certain actions, saying certain words, and trusting that the ritual will form us in life-giving ways. And to my students, I say, well, the simplest thing we can do is distinguish between ritual and ritualistic form and formalistic. We just add ism to anything. We can say anything can be abused. And of course, Christians have been attentive to that for, hundreds of years. But I think there is something decisive in choosing to say, in our families, right? In our friendships, we don't always feel it, right? We don't always feel love, but it is meet and right, to use, the language of the Book of Common Prayer, to open my body up to my wife when we're, kind of grumpy at each other instead of closing myself off, to speak words that I know my heart will maybe eventually catch up. And I think that can happen when we gather in worship.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's shift gears a little bit, because I do want to explore the conversation around seating arrangements. You have this really interesting conversation about midway through the book where you talk about the 3 seating arrangements. Mm-hmm. So I really kind of got into church architecture as I began to kind of just pay attention more. And I was fascinated, especially with like mainline context, especially at least in my neck of the woods, where churches have they have kind of the original sanctuary that was pretty modest, often built like in the 40s, early 50s. And then kind of after like the post-war boom, these huge, magnificent sanctuaries were built, like late 50s, 60s. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I noticed this what I felt at least to be this tension or contradiction of what is often proclaimed in mainline churches of a real progressive, inclusive, relational theology with these sanctuary spaces that are very, upward oriented and separated. Talk more about, how worship spaces shape our faith.
Right. Yeah. So in a book before A Body of Praise, one of the books that I wrote is called Glimpses of the New Creation. And in that book, I explore how the different media of arts form us. And the basic argument I make in that book is that every practice of art, whatever it may be, every instant of art, both opens up and closes down possibilities to form to form our knowledge and love of God in some fashion. And I try to be as generous and hospitable in the book to be able to say, I'm not going to come down on the Pentecostals. I'm not going to come down on, the high church Lutherans. I simply want you to understand that what you do is not neutral.
Yeah.
And you may be missing out on the fullness of what God may have for you. It doesn't mean you can, build new cathedrals, whatever it is. But be mindful of the fact that every space retains associations. Every space is generating a certain way of being in the world individually and corporately or communally. And so I talk about the 3 spaces. One, which, we'll call them longitudinal, sort of, you think of like the Gothic cathedral, Neo-Gothics, a long nave, and you have the transepts and the chancel and so on and so forth. And the idea there is that the Christian life is a pilgrimage, and you're coming from the world, the world, the place of the profane, which is the Latin for outside the temple. You enter in, and there's a baptismal font, and it's a pilgrimage. And then there's the New Jerusalem, hopefully, and that's beautiful. That kind of space resonates architecturally with images of God is majestic, God is holy other, God is sovereign. Those images that we find in Holy Scripture. It's very difficult, however, for people in that space to have any sense or grasp or feel, both in the literal and the figurative senses of those terms, for the body of Christ as a family. It's just, our bodies are not oriented. No, every generation of Christians is reacting to these kinds of things. And 20 years ago is the emergent church. That was very fired up about many things. And I was in the middle of some of that fired upness. And they wanted to return to a different idea of being the body of Christ, a different way of worshiping, and therefore they all found other spaces in which to do this, right? Many of them did it in homes, which is a very kind of natural place, to explore alternative ways of worshiping together. So there's a longitudinal, there's sort of what I'll call sort of the semicircular, half moon, and there's a wonderful CRC church up in Grand Rapids that I visited and had a chance to talk to some of them and to understand how the half moon is a way to gather around the table. So everybody has sort of like an equal sight line. But it's not a full circle because, as Reformed people, they wanted to underscore the fact that we do not enclose or master God, in this sense, symbolically at the table. There's a window and it opens up a way of saying, hey, when we come to this table, we are always recipients, recipients. And then the last, seating arrangement is, the face-to-face, which I say, well, we see in the upper room, many places in the Gospels, a lot of house churches have that very keen sense of like we are beholding one another. Is very intimate. But conversely, it's difficult to get a feel for otherness and majesty and so-called transcendence in those kinds of spaces. But, not every church can change, but maybe there are micro changes that enable people to be, more fully and richly related to each other as the body of Christ.
Yeah, I'm thinking of, there's a church in Minneapolis. Well, I guess there's 3 churches in one building. I'm not sure if you've heard this. Yeah, one's a disciples church. One's, I think, UCC. I can't remember what the other one is. Okay. But they have 3 worship spaces, and part of their practice is to rotate through the worship spaces throughout the year. That's amazing. I don't know what the regularity is, but I've always found that interesting to that perspective of changing perspectives.
Yeah. There are ways that we can, you could say disrupt. It doesn't have to be disruptive. It can just sort of be creative. And I think maybe one of the ways that the Catholic tradition has, creatively taken into account sort of the fixity of, their usual, let's say their usual, it's not like 2,000 years worth, but, sort of a certain style of architecture is all the feast days are opportunities to become ambulatory. So there can be an opportunity to walk around or to go outside, for, the triumphal entry, reenactment. And so getting out of the space, and we do that in our church as well. The service starts outside in the parking lot and we walk together, and it's silly and it's goofy and, there's nothing terribly orchestrated about all our voices, but there's something convivial, right? Right. About that, that I think is, really beautiful.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, I'll try to be generous with my words here, but I'm just thinking about, some traditions where it's like the doors are closed, the lights are off, there's a countdown, you walk in darkness, can't see your neighbor.
Yes. No, that I've seen that. I mean, speaking of the emergent church, I remember lots of, folks, maybe pastors who had the authority and power to make these kinds of changes, removing pews and putting sofas and chairs.
Right.
And that was their way maybe to swing to the opposite end of the pendulum. Like, we want to be at home, come as you are. Nobody's the boss of anybody. It's sort of all these things that sort of collect into let's be a different people together. Eventually, sofas and chairs start talking. They acquire a gravitational force field of their own, and they move people in certain directions that, may fight other things.
Right.
That church leaders would like to form in folks. And so there's nothing neutral. That's the point of that book that I wrote. There's nothing neutral. Every space, every practice of music, opens up and closes down, for example. ways of knowing God. So yeah. So in that book, I actually do a close study of Oceans by Hillsong.
Oh yeah. Okay.
And In Christ Alone, sort of the Reformed Baptist, song. And
yes.
A spiritual. And I sort of do a close analysis of the music and the lyrics, and just a way to say, hey, if you unpack the engine of all this stuff, it's the difference between a Blender engine and a Boeing engine. They're both engines, but they're making different things possible in the world.
Yeah, yeah. Let's do one more question here before we take a break.
Okay.
I want to talk about, on page 154, I'm going to read a quote here. You write, over against the prevailing assumption of our contemporary world, our bodies are not ours to do with as we please. Our bodies belong to Christ's flesh, and his flesh belongs to us. So you kind of wrote about it there, and I kind of gave you a heads up. I want to ask this question.
Yeah.
I similarly recognize this dynamic, I think, at least as I'm interpreting that quote, in our world today, where it's very much like a bodily autonomy. I'm sort of flabbergasted. I don't know if you've seen this on social media. These folks who are like anti-kids, and
yeah,
I have kids. I recognize it's a huge commitment, a lot of work, and I've had an experience literally just yesterday with my middle school daughter that's terrifying, frankly.
Right.
And I can't expand on that. So I understand like kids a lot, but I also think like this kind of time that we're focused on where it's like, it's me centered essentially, like I'm the biggest thing. And I guess my bias is I'm a believer that, believing in something bigger than yourself, or connecting with something bigger than yourself and giving of yourself is the best way to find yourself, rather than this kind of inverse that I think I see. And I'm assuming your quote relates to that, taking care of me and my body, my body's purpose is to serve me first and foremost.
Yeah. I think obviously, that part of the chapter or the book should be titled Handle with Care.
Yeah.
Ideas should be handled with care. People should be handled with care. Our neighbors who irk us,
right,
frustrate us, should be handled with care. All things should be handled with care. Probably what I'm doing there is attempting to identify extremes. It's easier, I think, to identify extremes than to identify the middles in which we're attempting in fits and starts, right? On one extreme, obviously, is slavery. That's the idea that my body wholly belongs to someone else to do it, as they wish. That is to be rejected. On the other end, perhaps more, we identify it with greater difficulty because we're Americans, is the idea that my body is my property, which to Americans seems to be the most normal way to think of my body.
Right.
Perhaps because we've forgotten, that our three, ideals are not actually life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The original actually was life, liberty, and the pursuit of property. So as Americans, property is very important to us. I have nothing wrong with property. I have property.
Right.
But the extreme, right, is that the entire earth, I'll use this verb, is colonized as property. Everything is perceived as property, right? Acquisition and retention of property. And then bodies get caught up in this, philosophical way of perceiving the world. And I think I'm pressing against that to say, as Christians, as people who want to be formed by Holy Scripture and by the life of Jesus, we see that bodies in the beginning are a gift. In the middle are a gift, and at the end are a gift. And because they are a gift, they are to be handled with care. They're handled with love. And there are things, that are mine, by God's, grace to enjoy fully. But my body's not something I own. I think that's the wrong verb. My body is something that is entrusted to me. And therefore I love it well. I'm to love my neighbor as I love myself. But it's not, I don't own it. and therefore to do with as I please.
Yeah.
I think that just sends us in very, very dangerous places. I mean, even with the best of intentions,
right?
Property mindset, I think, gets us in trouble, because the moment I think of myself as property and then I see others, they have property, well, then we're in a commercial, frame of mind. It's just sort of a, exchange of services and goods, and bodies become part of the thing that we exchange. And I think, like the Christian tradition uses this language of the great exchange, the mysterious exchange of Christ's body for our bodies. Like our bodies become part of his, so that our bodies can become truly, the bodies, the beautiful, beloved bodies that God made them in the beginning. And I think it's a way of thinking, but I think it's a way of living that gets us into trouble the moment we think of our bodies as property, that we possess autonomously.
Yeah. Tell me if this is tracking, if I'm following. Again, I'm just thinking of my day yesterday where I was planning to come home from work or not come home, but just head to the gym straight after work, because I like taking care of my body, right?
Yeah.
Keeping my body fit, which we would say is important.
Yeah.
But, I'm thinking of it from your entrusted context. There was a situation at home that I felt like my physical presence would be supportive. I don't know which adjective to use there. Would be a benefit to my family at home. So, I mean, does that track with what you're saying? Like, if we're thinking purely like my body is my own, my first priority is to my body, rather than my body is entrusted to me to do good in the world, to serve others. Yeah. But also to serve, I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I would say yes, right? Like if we think of our bodies as a gift that is entrusted to us, and then the primary lens or software that's running inside of us is a gift economy. Well, that changes the way I relate to the earth. That changes the way that I relate to my enemies. It changes the way that I relate to the people closest to me who perhaps see all the ways in which I fail in bodily acts of love, the primal sin led to the primal temptation, which is to hide, fight, and run. So we hide in our bodies, we fight with our bodies, right? And ultimately we're doing violence to our bodies and the bodies of others. But if my body is fundamentally a gift, graced by God in Christ, empowered by the Spirit, to be a vehicle, an instrument of healing, and, all the other goods of God's reign, then, it changes. I mean, okay, I'm going to say this and I hope I don't get too in trouble, but I remember not long after COVID, we were driving somewhere. I mean, it was like a year after, and driving through a small town, and it was like by like a little shopping center, and I saw these people, and I first thought it was like a car wash, like a bunch of Christians in a car wash, but they had big cardboard signs up. I couldn't see them, and then drove by and looked back. I was like, oh, they're protesting the vaccine.
Interesting.
And on all their cardboards was my body, my choice.
Right.
And I thought, oh, this is so fascinating. It's just like a quintessentially American. And I don't want to get into the politics of it all, but just sort of like that was the most natural phrase, as it were, the most natural way for Americans to think of these things. And I guess I'm wanting to say, I think for followers of Jesus, there is not just a better, like it's like an upgrade. I think it's just like ontologically, radically better.
And if I can take this step further as I'm thinking about this, like, I'm sure you've seen the news, right? That young men are increasingly moving conservative, moving into church spaces. And it seems like, I don't want to make too broad a judgment here, that there's this kind of like encouragement of young masculinity as like celebrating them and their bodies. And I think I want to like echo what you're saying here. I was having a conversation on this with one of my good friends who also has a son about teaching your sons that manliness is about he didn't use this word, but I think your word here fits with what he's saying. This kind of gift economy, like men have privilege, and we're supposed to use that privilege or that what has been entrusted to us to serve others. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I would say yes. And, I wrote a book of prayers that came out recently, prayers for the pilgrimage. And one of the prayers that I had included there was, I had originally titled it it was like something like for being Jesus-y. And then the publisher was like, well, maybe you can come up with a better. And I was like, well, I think what I'm trying to do is to name in this prayer all the things that all the ways that Jesus handles other people's bodies with care. And saying, to myself and to my son, let's do that. Yeah. You do that, and that'll generate life. That'll be life-giving to your mother, to your sister, to your friends. To be in the world as Jesus was in the world. I think I saw this article that you're referencing, and I mean, we just live in such catastrophically messed up times. but in terms just get us in trouble, or they are trouble. And so I guess maybe what I'm trying to do with myself, and in this book is to say, what if we simply tracked how it is that Jesus handles people's bodies. And in fact, the point that I'm making in the book is not only does he handle others with care, he himself for 9 months in his mother's womb was handled with supreme care. Yeah. He was totally enveloped in this care-filled place of comprehensive, loving touch. And I suggest that can be like a metaphor for then he emerges and then offers his body as the life for the world, and offers comprehensive care in and through his body, and that we are now his body in our own places. So, yeah.
Well, let's leave it there for the sake of time. This is good conversation. Again, the book is that we discussed today, A Body of Praise, Understanding the Role of Our Physical Bodies in Worship. David, let's make sure, send me a link for the other book so I can include that in the show notes. Let's take a quick break, and we'll come back with some closing questions. All right, we're back with David Taylor, and really enjoyed the conversation. Appreciate your time. Hopefully it's helpful for our listeners. Let's talk about some of these closing questions. You're welcome to take these as seriously or not as you'd like to. Some folks get tripped up over the Pope question, but what would you do with your if you're a Pope for a day?
Okay, so I thought about this. Again, I grew up in a Catholic country, so there's a lot of talk of the Pope amongst my friends. El Papa, as they would call it. If I were Pope for the day, I would tell my secretary that I'm going to spend the entire day looking at all the art in the Vatican collection. Alternatively, I would tell my secretary that I'm going to disguise myself and go for morning prayer or whatever, morning mass in some small church in Rome, disguise, and just kind of slip into the pew and experience life that way. Just kind of like take a peek of, I imagine that the Pope does not get many opportunities just to chill out.
Yeah.
I think that'd be kind of fun.
A theologian or historical Christian figure you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
Okay, so I did think about this, and I apologize in advance. I'm going to cheat.
Yeah.
I would like a dinner party.
Okay.
And it's going to be a dinner party for 6, myself included, and I'm going to invite 5 musicians, and I would love to see the conversation that unfolded. I'm going to invite Ephraim the Syrian, who's very profoundly influential in the Eastern Orthodox tradition. Hildegard of Bingen, Palestrina, very influential in polyphonic Renaissance music, Bach, and Fanny Crosby. And I just want to ask him, like, what was it like? Cause you guys all made new music, in your time. And we have worship wars in our time. Did you guys? I mean, I know they actually had worship wars in their time. I just want to hear them talk about it. I think it'd be so fun.
That's a broad spectrum. I guess you could make it 7 and maybe invite Chris Tomlin and just see what happens.
I mean, I could. Sure. Let's. I'll take him, Chris.
I don't know. am I making assumptions? Who would be like the definitive like worship guy or woman?
I mean, Chris is, certainly in, the kind of like contemporary worship world.
Right.
I mean, nobody really cares about him. More kind of classical, conservatory kind of music.
Yeah.
It'd be that, or like I once hung out with the Hillsong London folks.
Okay.
A number of years ago, David Crowder organized this crazy worship conference, invited me, and I found myself in the green room surrounded by all unusual bedfellows, including Hillsong. They were, I don't know how much you can capitalize, bold, and italicize cool. They were so cool. And I was like, yeah, nope, I'm not cool. I'm not cool. I'm okay. But I don't know. Hillsong, they're pretty big.
Yeah. Yeah.
But,
But who's like we're getting way into the weeds here, but I'm like, who's the one? Is it like Darlene Zschech? Maybe she gets in there.
I mean, she's certainly like the 90s,
right.
forerunner, of this whole, era. I mean, Chris, he's pretty influential. Like he changed, but these days, they talk about the big four: Hillsong,
right,
Bethel, Passion, and Elevation.
Yeah.
They're the ones that show up on the Christian stations. But like a singular figure, sure, I'll go. Yeah. Chris is just always like, top 5.
As long as it's, not, who's the Elevation guy? As long as it's not him, right? No offense to my.
No, I don't know. I mean, I will tell you, I'm friends with Matt Redman, who is another figure in that world. And he very wonderfully, kindly, humbly reached out a year ago and said, I'd love to partner with a theologian, and I'd love all the songwriters that I know to have opportunities to partner with pastors and theologians, because I think that church's music is not good. It's better, and it's only going to get better if we have better relationships.
Let me say this. I won't say his name, but Elevation's pastor maybe could do well to be in that group.
Okay, well.
Moving on. What do you think? What do you think history will remember from our current time and place?
I mean, gosh, I don't know. Really, I'll be curious to know. I mean, the thing that comes to mind is that no generation is exempt from corruptibility. And the truth of the matter is, I really would like to not excuse myself from that judgment. I'd like for everybody else to be corruptible by their, cultural context, but I'm sure I am. I wonder, I mean, this is the thing that I've wondered, for the past 8 years and counting. Has there been a massive failure of discipleship in our churches at the local kind of, ho-hum, ordinary, shape of our lives, that it makes it possible for things to now surface so egregiously? That stuff doesn't happen overnight, right? I don't know. I mean, yeah.
Well, how about this? What do you hope then for the future Christianity?
I think it's like my hope is related to sort of the lament, but I think I would hope that we in this country, I'll just speak for us, might become more fully attuned, related with, and accountable to the global church. I think we get in trouble more quickly when we get sucked under, our own echo chambers. And wherever we may find ourselves theologically, ecclesially, politically, we all have echo chambers. And I think Leslie Newbigin, the wonderful missionary theologian, wrote a book called Foolishness to the Greeks. And he talks about how one of the practices that the global church should take on is members of Christ's body around the globe should just continuously hold mirrors up to one another to show where it is that the good news is being corrupted, where we are being malformed in ways that we just cannot perceive. So I think if we were able to find ourselves not just on, social media, reading about things, but traveling, if possible, inviting and participating in meals and worship together and mission together, I think it could be very powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I really appreciate your time, really appreciate the conversation. Again, want to recommend the book and your work. Tell folks where they can connect with you, all that stuff.
Yeah. So on what formerly called Twitter.
Yeah.
Which we'll still call Twitter. It's kind of the name that usually shows up on books, W. David O. Taylor. On Instagram, somebody actually had that collection of letters. I was surprised, but they had one follower on Instagram. So there's no way I could recover it. So it's David Taylor _ So Instagram is kind of more personal. Twitter is just more ideas. And then I have a website, www.davidotaylor.com. I try to be a gracious presence. I wrote a series of Beatitudes for being on social media, so I try to abide by those Beatitudes.
Yeah, great. Well, always leave folks with a word of peace, speaking of rituals and practices here. So may God's peace be with you.
And also with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is produced by Resonate Media. We love to hear from our listeners with questions, comments, and ideas for future episodes. Visit our website at future-christian.com and find the Connect with Us form at the bottom of the page to get in touch with Martha or Loren. But before you go, do us a favor. Subscribe to the pod to leave a review. It really helps us get this out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.